Well, hey there everybody, it's Mr. Verzat. Today I'd like to show you guys kind of a brief tutorial on how to create a coin. We're going to manipulate shapes and use a lot of filters and play around with photographs. So let's get started. So by now you've designed your coins already, pretty much got them all laid out, and you've made several thumbnails to generate the design you're going to have. Also, you took a very serious and professional photograph of yourself, like this one, and we're going to doctor that up. So the first thing you do is start with your shape tool. Your shape tool is located right here, and it's going to be a coin, right? So we just make a circle. Now make sure you hold down your shift key as you do that, or else you might have a circle that's kind of strange shaped. Now nobody says you can't go outside the box. Actually, I'd encourage you guys to do that. I mean, look at any type of ancient money that's been around, like ancient China, you know, different dynasties there. They've got money that has like negative space inside of it, you know, holes and stuff. But, you know, try to keep it real, just going down the road that we studied in class on what goes on money, why it's shaped the way it is, and so forth. So, got my shape right here, and here's some of the production thinking that goes into using Photoshop. I'm just going to duplicate this layer, and let's change it so it's a little bit lighter of a color. Now this is going to be the field of our coin, or the face. This is where all the action is going to take place. And we want there to be a rim visible. So I'm going to take, basically I've got two circles now. I duplicated one, made the other lighter, and let's shrink it down. So I'm going to Command T, that's just a free transform. And did you know that rather than shift clicking and trying to maneuver this thing around, you can otherwise do this. Hold down Option and then Shift, and it will shrink it inward to the center. So each coin has a little rim here, and that's to help them stack. And so now we have one layer that is a small circle and another that is a large one. Now let's import our photograph. So this is in color, and we're going to be applying a variety of effects to this. And so just like any ingredient that you use before you cook, you want to prepare it. And so the first thing we need to do is make it go black and white. So Image, Adjustments, Black and White. You can also desaturate the image if you wanted to. That's by going to Image, Adjustments, and Hue and Saturation, and then just turning the saturation all the way down. Now we have to get rid of all this background, and there's a couple ways you can do that. First would be you could use your magic wand tool. You could also use the quick selector tool here. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's a little finicky. And so, for example, if I start to select this background, sure enough, it's grabbing the background, but a lot of other things that I don't want it to grab. And so this will introduce you guys to your next technique, is how to use the lasso tool. See, I have my entire face selected here. So let me just get rid of that by using the quick selector, holding down Option, and you see that little minus sign on the key. Just push that back up and it'll deselect all those parts. So here's how you use the lasso tool to kind of clean up. L is for lasso tool, and if you hold down Shift, you might, here, if you zoom in close enough you see it, there's a little plus sign next to it. Well, what I want to do is select the background and get rid of it. So I'm going to hold down Option, you see now there's a little minus sign. Well, I'm going to go in here and draw pretty roughly, because you know we're going to have the stamped surface of a coin visible, and tiny minute details is pretty much going to be irrelevant here, but I'm just going to try to stay generally within the area of my face. And so, for example, right now my cursor is on the edge of the screen, so I'm going to hold down space, and that'll change to my hand tool and allow me to shift upward, all right? And then I'm just going to let go and then continue to use this lasso tool. I'm going to circle the areas that I don't want. Let's see the selection that's inside of my head. And there we go. All right, so let's see if there's any other areas. I'm going to speed up the video or just jump ahead and clean this little fella up. Before we do anything else, we've got to make sure that the levels are adjusted properly. If you've got a well-shot photograph, you'll have a great range of darks through lights, but that can't always be guaranteed. So let's use the computer to do that. I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and Levels. You'll be doing this a lot, not only throughout your project, but in future projects. Best to memorize the shortcut for that. That's Command L. So if we click on that, let's take a look at our levels, and sure enough, we do have pretty good range. What an image would look like that didn't have good levels would be like lots of flat space and then a spike of activity. So in that case, to make your levels adjustment look good, you would drag your little arrows so that they reach the foot of the mountain. Sorry I don't have an example to show you, but yeah, so far so good. Now let's trim this little guy out of here. Now let's look at adding some gradients, just some activity in here to make it look more like a coin and less like a circle or a framed image. So I'm going to, again, command click the face of my coin. That's where a lot of action is going to take place. Let's drop a little gradient in there. You can find the gradients underneath the paint bucket tool, and I'm going to create a new layer. And using this marching ant selection that's currently made, I've got my head on top, by the way. So I'm going to drop this gradient in behind it. And you can play with a variety of different gradients. This one has 3 colors in it. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Now let's add some effects to it. Let's make this rim look as if it's rised up, kind of popping out. And so on the layer that has the gradient, I'm going to click over here in the little gray area of the layer window. Double click actually, and that brings up what's called a layer style. This is the window that controls any special effects that you apply to that layer. So for example, like an outer stroke or glow, or drop shadow, all that good stuff. So let's zoom in a little closer to the coin so we can get a good look. And double click on our gradient layer. And let's do what's called an inner shadow. There. So you can see it right here. An inner shadow kind of casts a little bit of a drop shadow from the rim. Remember, this is taking place entirely on just the face of the coin. If I get rid of that back rim layer, here is the inner shadow effect. All right, so let's drop an inner glow. Basically, that does the exact same thing, and you can find that right here. And we can play with some of those settings, for example, like how strong the inner glow is and so on. So you can barely see it. It's actually showing up down here in this area. So if we turn it off and on, it kind of makes it look like it's catching light here and then casting shadow here. All right, let's move on to the actual effects on how we make this look like a coin. So we're going to deal with what are called filters. Can't really see it on the screen right now, but right up here, you have what are called filters. Those are special effects. There are 2 filters we're going to use here. One works really well, and the other works sort of well for texture. One that works really well is called Emboss. So if you go to Filter, Stylize, and then Emboss, wouldn't hurt if we were on the proper layer. So Filter, Stylize, Emboss. That applies this really crazy, ugly looking effect to your photograph. And there's a couple of areas I'd like you to notice. Up at the top, I wouldn't mess with that too much. What it is to make the emboss effect, it actually just has 2 images that it runs negative and positive next to each other. If we turn it all the way off, it's pretty washed out. If we turn it up just a little, it offsets those dark and light pixels, so we have kind of a metallic look. Now, the amount of the emboss is, think of it as the amount of texture that you put into it. All the way off, there's not much, just but a gray silhouette. And if you really ratchet it up, it looks like you have metallic acne. So try to find kind of a balance between the 2. At this point, don't worry about contrast. We can fix all of this with a levels adjust. And right now I'm liking the texture, and so let's just say OK. And now let's apply a levels adjust. Remember, you go to Image, Adjustments, and Levels. Now this is an example of an image that needs a levels adjust, and it's just looking at, this shows all the amount of gray pixels that are in use. There's almost no black and very few whites. So what we do is we bring these arrows up to the foot of the mountain, and it starts to increase the contrast in the image. Now I want it to be shiny, like the shiny face of a coin, so I'm actually going to break that rule a little bit. Let's take the white and really kind of ratchet that up, and we're starting to get like that nice sheen that a coin has here. I'm going to say, OK. Now if you want to do subtle adjustments to it, for example, like let's say you want to make some areas stand out because it's a little too flat. Well, what you can do is you can manually paint in some darks and lights. So for example, like let's imagine that, well, like right down here, if I want a little more definition on the bottom of my face, then what I could do would be to create a new layer. I'm going to call this, let's just say darks. I'm going to set that to a blending mode called multiply. Now remember, what a blending mode does is it makes layers see-through. So I'm going to take, like say a dark gray and a soft-edged brush, and I'm going to set the strength of my brush opacity way down, and let's see what happens if we just lightly paint in, really emphasize that double chin there. What do you think? Yeah. And since it's on its own layer, if you do too much, switch to an eraser that's soft-edged, turn the strength of your eraser down, and just kind of feather that out a little bit. So it is a good way to increase the contrast in some areas So like if you want to really emphasize the contrast under the eye sockets, just to make it kind of pop a little bit. And if it's too loud, just turn down the opacity. Now the same exact thing works with the color white set to an overlay blending mode. All right, overlay does the same thing multiply does. It allows pixels to show through, except with this one, it does mainly the lights. So if I really want some areas to pop, let's use some white. Let's turn a soft eraser down there, and let's just maybe like add a sheen to it here. This is one way you can correct the lighting on your coin if there was a mistake. And if it's too hot, again, it's on its own layer. Use a soft-edged eraser that's turned way down and just feather the edges and work on that a little bit. All right, let's talk text. So what do you do to get that embossed text kind of a feel? So I'm going to use a tool called the horizontal type mask tool. And what it does is it works just like Microsoft Word. You type with it, only it turns your screen red and turns the text itself into a selection, which means we can copy, paste, fill that selection in, and do all sorts of cool stuff. So with that said, here's the way it works. Choose a font that's chunky enough and that you can read clearly. It doesn't make any sense if your design has really novel fonts that nobody can read. All right, so let's just do like say 1964 or something along those lines. Now while your screen is still red, you can hold the command button down and it makes a bounding box over here, and you can still drag and adjust the placement of your elements here. Once you hit the check mark up here, you're committed, and now you've got your selection. So now I'm going to make the text. I'm going to make a brand new layer, and using a brush, let's just get, say, like a middle gray, and I'm going to paint in that middle gray. Let's deselect the image, and now that is our, so far, our text. And let's apply a layer style to it that makes it feel like it's raised up. Remember, layer styles are located by clicking on this area of your layer window. And I'm going to use bevel and emboss. That's pretty much your go-to for any type of raised metallic surface. Now there are several different ways we can do this. We can have them go down into the coin. We can have it rise up. Maybe tweak the size a little bit. It's, see if it's so small in pixel dimensions that if we go much larger, it just starts to blur all the effect together. So that doesn't really help. Depth does add a little harsh edge to it, which is cool. Now let's take a look at some different styles. So we've got what's called a pillow emboss, which is pretty cool, and that kind of stamps it down there with an edge. Let's try a stroke emboss. Doesn't really do much. Outer bevel. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So generally, use what works best for you. I'm going to take my circle shape tool, and let's just make, just a generic circle. I'm going to eyeball it to try to get it in the center, kind of a quick and dirty approach here. And you know what? Let's turn the opacity down just so I can kind of see. One thing you could do also with your shape tool active is turn off fill and give it just a tiny outer stroke, just so we can see the lines of that shape. And hopefully you guys can see. I'm going to beef it up a little bit more. There we go. So the circle's not going to actually be in the image. What I'm going to do is wrap text around the circle. Now remember, let's shrink that circle down. Hold down Option and Shift, and that will shrink it inward towards the center. And so that way, the text will conform to the radius of this coin. Okay? So let's select our horizontal type mask tool and look very closely at the icon. When I put the text icon over the contours of the circle shape, you might not see it, but there's a small little wavy line that goes through it. That means that it will allow you to type around the circle. So if you want to rotate this at all, hold down Command, move to the outside of the bounding box, and you can still rotate it right along the edge of that shape. Now, you see we got some serious design problems here. We've got two elements that are clashing. That line is going right through both our date and our scribble text. So I'm going to rasterize this, which allows me to erase. So rasterize layer. You can get your eraser tool, or you know what, an easier way is just grab your lasso and grab basically areas where you want to cut off. Lasso that out, hit delete, bye-bye line, and let's give that a bevel and emboss. So when you find your textures, make sure they're high res. You can take your own photos, or you can find some open source texture images. I'm going to kind of show you how you can piggyback a gradient off of a texture here. So let's grab this guy, drag and drop. And just like we did before, let's find that front face layer that we had. I command clicked it to select the whole thing. And what I want to do is trim the coin texture. So I'm going to go select, inverse, make sure that you got the coin layer selected, and then delete. Now, we've got to ask ourselves, is that polished metal texture going to have any part with this imprinted face that you see? And I think the answer to that structurally is no. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that texture underneath my face, and then I'm going to turn the opacity, kind of play with that, turn it up and down. One thing you can also do is play with your blending modes. I'm going to do overlay and soft light. Let's see what those do. And that allowed our gradient that we had below to show through, and we still see some of the grain from that metallic circle. And I'm going to be kind of intentional. I'm going to be selective with the textures that I want. So let's just set this to a blending mode. And you know what? Those scratches probably happened after the coin was made. So I'm going to stick them on top of the whole piece here. So let's try overlay or soft light. And holy smokes, did we mark that thing up. Well, I'm only going to keep some scratches because, see, this is pretty overpowering and not very appealing. So I'm really liking kind of what's happening here. With a soft eraser at about like 80% or so, I'm just going to erase out the areas that I don't need. Especially if it clashes. And then if I like that, let's just take and duplicate the layer. You can go to Command J for the shortcut, or just right click on the layer on your window and go duplicate layer. And we can move that texture over, rotate it. You don't want it to look like the same repeating pattern all over the place, but then just selectively get rid of some of the areas that you don't want. I've selected this, and let's go to our paint bucket. It's found under the gradient. Drop that in there. And we're going to, again, you guessed it, use a blending mode. And we're going to use one called color. What color blending mode does is it generally affects the gray areas. Blacks and whites go through, but you know, the beauty of this is, you know, you can turn it on and off. You can also go to image adjustments, and very, you know, general, you can go to hue and saturation, and you can change the color of the coin. You know, to do that, like for example, if you want kind of a copperish type color. Now you can also be intentional with different parts of it. What if we selected my embossed face and then removed that from the actual color? So I'm going to command click, for example, this bas relief is pretty much the shape of my head. I command click the thumbnail to make the selection, and then let's just cut that right out of the color layer at the top. And you see it looks like there's two different types of metal used. You can also do that for your type. Let's cut that out from the color and see how that looks. It's good for emphasis, it's good for effect. Or you can really creep people out and think they're different types of material strictly for the face. All right, so I hope this is helpful. That's generally how you design a coin. In class, we can go over like how you get little ridges on the outside. That can be a little more complicated. You need to stitch some things together quite a bit. All right, you guys, I hope this was helpful. I look forward to seeing you in class. Bye-bye.